Hi, Daniel J. Lewis here. This is Podcasting Q&A for October 9th, 2017. I'm trying something new I want to tell you about right up front. Usually I don't talk about the particular microphones and such I'm using or want to draw attention to if I'm doing something different, but you will probably notice something different, especially if you're watching the video and maybe if you're listening to this, if this is available as a podcast version, which I keep thinking about. Anyway, what I'm doing differently is instead of having my studio microphone in front of me, I'm experimenting with instead using a lav mic that I'm wearing that's plugged into a wireless system that's going into my mixer. It doesn't really need to be a wireless system because my mixer is within arm's reach of me. So it doesn't have to be wireless, but it is wireless. And this is giving me a nice preamp for the wireless microphone. And this is the Rode News Shooter kit, which includes the XLR plug-on transmitter. But the reason I'm trying this for the live Q&A here is being that this is primarily video and primarily live, at least at the moment, I feel like not having a microphone directly in front of me would make this a whole lot more engaging. For one thing, there's not this distracting thing here next to me like that. It's nice and out of the way. So it's not distracting you. It's also not distracting me. It's not getting in the way of things. The lighting ends up looking better because you can see a shadow cross over my face as I move this over. Lighting's not that bad though if it's right here, but still there's a slight shadow. It's fine. But at least having the microphone out of the way, it doesn't block the light at all. It doesn't create any awkward shadows or anything like that. It means I have full range of motion with my hands. And what I feel like is that by not having a microphone then in this shot, it might make this seem a little bit more intimate, more personal, more like I'm talking directly to you and not so much like I'm recording a podcast. So, what do you think? If you're watching this live, or if you're watching the replay, please comment to let me know what you think. And then also join me when I do these things live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitypodcast.com/live. This is where I answer your podcasting questions. I receive a lot of questions through email, through Twitter and other channels, and I want this to be a place where I can answer those questions for you. So if you have any questions while I'm recording this live, then please comment below this video, or if you're watching the replay of this either on Facebook or on YouTube, then email me feedback@theaudacitypodcast.com, or you can tweet me at the Daniel J. Lewis too. So I've got a bunch of questions that have come in recently, and these are all sent directly to me. First one is from Raganaut. He asked, my podcast is in a few unwanted websites like player.fm and many others I didn't want it to be in. Do I need to worry about this, or what action do I need to take? So first, no, you don't need to worry about it. This is good, actually. You want your podcast to be in multiple places because people subscribe to podcasts through many different platforms and tools and apps. So many of these places, if your podcast is available in those places, that means people can subscribe through those places, like player.fm, for example, which is the one in particular that you mentioned. That is another app, another directory, and people listen to podcasts there. You could get really controlling and silo your content and say, no, it's only available on Apple Podcasts, or it's only available on Stitcher, or only available here, or these certain places like that. But if you do that, you're limiting your audience for really no good reason. I can understand some people not wanting to be in particular platforms because of not being able to see analytics from that platform, or those analytics not counting back toward your regular stats that you're able to take to an advertiser. For example, Google Play Music. Although you can see your stats inside of Google Play Music, those stats don't go back to your podcast host. So if you're being paid from Libsyn, from Blueberry, Spreaker, anybody like that, for how many downloads an episode receives, then those plays on Google Play Music don't count to your plays. So you're not getting paid for that. However, I think building an audience is far more important than trying to increase your download numbers so that you get paid more. In fact, wouldn't you rather have those audience members than not? And that's very likely the case. If someone is listening to your podcast on Google Play Music, it's very likely that if you weren't on Google Play Music, they might not be listening to you at all. They might not have discovered you at all. Now, in your podcast, you can say, hey, subscribe through this or whatever app you recommend, and they might migrate over to that. But I don't recommend siloing your content to say it's only available in these particular podcast apps and directories. So you don't need to worry about it when your podcast shows up in other apps and directories. That's a good thing, and that's the nature of podcasting. It's extremely decentralized. What you do want to watch out for, and you can check this very easily when you see your podcast show up in these other places, you want to make sure that number one, when people subscribe, they are subscribed to your RSS feed. And number two, when they download episodes, they're downloading from your media URLs. So they're downloading from your web host or from your media host through your RSS feed. So if you change your RSS feed, if you publish new episodes, your audience still gets those. So how does this even happen in the first place? I don't think you need to take any action to prevent your podcast from showing up in those different apps and directories. Some apps and directories do require you to submit to them. So besides what happens automatically, which I'll explain in a moment, places like Google Play Music, Stitcher, and a few other places do require you to manually submit your podcast to them. And I think it's worth doing that because it means your podcast can then be more accessible in other places. Yes, there's the possibility that those other apps and services might put an ad before or after your content or within the experience of the app. I think that's fine. If they're monetizing around your content, I think that's okay. If you get in front of an audience that you wouldn't have otherwise had by being in those apps or directories, isn't that worth it? If that company gets to make 10 cents off of your podcast being in their directory, I don't think you have to be so policing of your platform to say any monetization has to be yours. Now, if someone is selling your podcast, that's a different issue altogether. That's a definite legal copyright issue. But if someone is merely distributing it in their platform and their platform happens to contain ads, that's not something we should shy away from. I know some directories may say things like they reserve the right to edit or insert ads midstream. I haven't actually seen any apps actually do that. Certainly, I see ads inserted in the experience, like in the app or on the website. I see ads put before a podcast or after a podcast. And maybe that's what they mean by in stream, because that ad is actually in the file, the media file that's downloaded through that app. Maybe, maybe not. But I haven't seen them actually like interrupt your content to put in an ad. I could be wrong. Maybe there's someone out there who is actually doing that. So there are certain situations where you might want to be considerate of that. So how does your podcast end up in all of these other places? Many podcast apps and directories are smart about populating their own directory and search by pulling from the Apple iTunes API. And this is a special programming way that other apps can use iTunes to search for a podcast, use their special thing that's called an API, a way that programs can communicate with each other, so that they can search that catalog that already exists and that most podcasters have submitted their shows to, so it contains most podcasts out there. And they can make their app a lot easier to use, a lot easier to find your favorite podcasts by making it search the iTunes catalog, which is good. So once you get in Apple Podcasts or iTunes, that means that your podcast can then be searchable or subscribed to or found in dozens of other podcast apps and directories. And that's a good thing. You may go to Google and you do a search for your podcast, and you may see some of these other sites turn up. Like you'll see your own page. Maybe you have a Facebook page for your podcast. Maybe you have a player.fm page shows up. Maybe Stitcher, maybe Google Play Music, maybe all of these other places. And I think that's good. because of this, you are dominating the first page of that Google search result. And this is something I talk about in my SEO for Podcasters course, which, by the way, is on sale over at theaudacitytopodcast.com. If you dominate the first page with the relevant search, then that means people can't help but find your content for those relevant searches. And that's a good thing. Even if it's taking them to player.fm, that's good because it's still taking them to your content. And your podcast is sort of a funnel for them to connect with you in other ways, whether you're monetizing your podcast or simply building a community. So dominating that first page with all of your podcast search results in these different apps and directories is great. Your website should be top or near the top of that list, though. And if it's not, then you need some SEO work to do on your site. So don't worry about those kinds of things. Now, if you're on the opposite side of this and you're thinking, wait, I want to get my podcast into all of these apps and directories, well, then some of them you need to submit to, some of them you simply need to wait. The best thing to do is go to podcastplaces.com and browse all of the apps and directories over there. And that's a website that I maintain. It's a little outdated now, but I'll be getting some help to update that very soon. And that's a place where you can go to discover everywhere you and your podcast should be. So podcastplaces.com. Don't worry about showing up in all of these other apps and directories. Most of them are pretty ethical in how they handle your podcast. They subscribe people directly to your RSS feed, and they connect people with your download files. So thus, they count toward your own stats, and that's good. J.R. Cox said, I'm interested in starting a podcast about the original Karate Kid and how it relates to life in so many ways. Wax on, wax off. I wonder about use of copywritten material. Do you have to have a license to do what you have done with Once? He's talking about my Once Upon a Time podcast where we talk about the TV show, and the TV show is coming back for its spinoff, otherwise known as Season 7, and we're recording an episode of that podcast actually tonight, August 9th. So do you have to have a license? Here's the thing with copyrighted material. Everything actually is instantly copyrighted upon creation. So you have to always assume whatever you see is copyrighted unless it's otherwise indicated or indicated otherwise. Like that says public domain or free for commercial use, free for personal use, free whatever. So assume everything is copyrighted. Anything you find on the internet, images, audio, video, text, it's all copyrighted instantly and protectable by law, at least in the United States. So when you're talking about doing something like doing a podcast about movies or TV shows, do you have to have a license? Probably not. Now, all of this comes with the massive caveat, I am not a lawyer. So if you want true legal advice, you need to consult a lawyer. What I can tell you is passing on information I've learned from my background as a musician and also my relationship with other lawyers, copyright, intellectual property attorneys and such. And we have one inside of Podcasters Society. Gordon Firemark is our legal expert inside Podcasters Society. So what he and many other lawyers might tell you is it really depends on the nature of your work and whether that can then be excused or defended, in some way protected under what we call this fair use clause. Fair use clause in copyright is to say that while all things are copyrighted and you must have a license to use copyrighted stuff, there is an exception that if your content is commentary, review, criticism, educational, there are several other things that can describe the kind of content, but if you're using the copyrighted material for that content, for the sake of making that content, parody is another one too, that it's okay to use that copyrighted material. Now that doesn't mean you can stream the entire Karate Kid movie in your podcast because that's too much of it. And there's no 30-second or 20-second, 15-second rule or anything like that. Because 30 seconds could be too much of something. It could be just the right amount. There's no guideline to say if you're fine with 30 seconds. It's really about how much of the material is it that you're using and how much of your material is using that material. So if you have a 30-second podcast and 25 seconds of that are someone else's copyrighted material, you're using too much copyrighted material. If you have a 60-minute podcast that uses 30 seconds of copyrighted content, and that 30 seconds is 30 seconds of 200 minutes of copyrighted content, you're fine. That's a very small portion, but it also really depends on how you're using that portion of copyrighted stuff. So in your case, when you're talking about making a podcast about the original Karate Kid movie and how it relates to life in so many ways, it sounds like a fascinating podcast, by the way, then you're probably going to be okay under fair use. What you need to make sure is that what portions of Karate Kid you are using in your podcast are very short, are being used for the sake of your being able to comment on it. Think of it like this. The copyrighted material is giving you the context to create your content, your conversation about it. That's what we do with our Once Upon a Time podcast. And I have talked actually to Disney's lawyers because I opened my big mouth and sent a sort of legal request to them and then got shot back with another legal request from them that then said, well, actually, let's take a look at your stuff. But the conclusion of it is these companies appreciate fan content. And the Disney lawyer that I talked to, Disney is the parent company of ABC, and ABC is the network that Once Upon a Time airs on. So Disney is who I had to talk to. They own the copyrights for Once Upon a Time. So the lawyer did say, we don't want you to stop your podcast. We only need to make sure that there are these certain guidelines that you're following in certain ways that it's not, doesn't seem like it's officially affiliated with Disney and ABC. So we changed some things. That was more branding and trademark stuff. They said absolutely nothing about copyrighted stuff. And they did look at the website. They did see that I was using screenshots. They probably could assume I was using sound clips. But when we do that in our podcast, we'll do sometimes we've done 3-hour-long podcast episodes, and the total amount of copyrighted content in that was maybe a couple minutes if you were to mash it all together. So it's really about how much are you using, how are you using it. So if you're playing a quotation, so if you want to play wax on, wax off, and then you go off on a 10-minute tangent about all of the ways that applies to life, you're totally okay there. I would say you're okay. But of course, seek the advice of an actual lawyer for advice you can actually take to court if you have to. Austin said, I really need to learn more about compression and amplification of audio using Audacity. Audacity has some built-in compression and amplification tools inside of it. You can use the compressor in Audacity. It's a very standardized compressor. There is also Chris's dynamic compressor, which is a bit more simplified of an approach to compression. It's not necessarily something I still recommend because it's so non-standard. It doesn't use standard language, so you can't totally control your results, but it can produce some pretty good results. And when you're talking about amplification, Audacity certainly gives you the tools to amplify your audio, but the tools that are built in for amplifying aren't that good. Like you can't reach loudness normalization standards only with the tools built into Audacity. So that's why I would recommend aphonic.com, which is AUPHONIC.com, aphonic.com, or fixmylevels.com. Either of those are services that you can use to adjust that compression and the proper amplification of your audio to the loudness standards that we have, which would be -16 LUFS for stereo or -19 LUFS for mono. And that's much easier to do with those tools than with Audacity. Even if you have to pay for them, I think they're worth it because they do such a nice job and they do it so easily. Paul Cheall, I think is how you pronounce the name, asked, what is the best tool to get rid of mouth clicks, to fix them post-recording with Audacity, other software, or manually? The best way to get rid of mouth clicks is to avoid recording them in the first way. So there are two ways that you can do this. well, three things that can affect this. One is keep your mouth hydrated. Keep drinking water, and room temperature or lukewarm water is about the best thing. And speaking of which, I shall take a drink of some. The second thing is moisturize your lips. Both of these things together, so having a mouth that's been hydrated with water and having lips that are lotioned with some lip balm, these will help prevent a lot of those mouth clicks, because the reason you get those mouth clicks often are the result of a dry mouth. And when your mouth gets dry, it sticks together. And when it sticks together, moving it around makes all of those sounds that annoy a lot of people and don't sound all that great. So you can get much better audio by lubricating your mouth, by using lip balm, and that right there could solve the problem for you. The other thing to do is to try and get farther away from the microphone. Not too far away, but here with this microphone, try to be, with most studio microphones, try to be about a fist width away from the microphone. The closer you are to the microphone, the more it can hear those little noises. It's just like if you are on the other side of the room and I'm talking to you, you may hear my voice, but you don't hear the subtle little mouth noises I'm making. But if you come up right close to my mouth, you will hear them a bit more, because some of those noises just don't travel very much, or they're so small they get lost in other things. But if you stick a microphone right up close to you, you'll pick up those noises a lot more. So if you're too close to the microphone, back off a little bit. Be about a fist width away from the microphone, and make sure your mouth is hydrated and your lips are lotioned, moisturized. The other thing is you might not need to worry about it all that much, depending on how much lip noises or mouth noises there are. Emily Prokop in the chat room does mention, and this is another great reminder, green apples work really well, but they are pretty much only temporary. And that is, eat a green apple, and that helps clear some of those liquids and moisturize and some of that. But you can't really sit there and eat a green apple, podcast for a few minutes, take a bite, podcast for a few minutes. It doesn't really work, but drinking some water does. And by the way, as long as you're working with drinking water, make sure that you're not talking as you're about to take a drink, because this changes the tone of your voice. You're suddenly talking into a cup or a mug or something. Also, maybe try to make sure that there's no ice in it, because if there's ice, then when you're tipping it back and forth and taking a drink, there's that clink, 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 clink sound. Something with a straw could be really nice, because then it's quiet. It might be very easy to quickly get a drink and not have to worry about spilling it. And it can be less distracting too if you have to do it while you're on camera, instead of having some bottle or cup up to your face and having to tip it over. You can also practice saying things without as many lip noises. One of the ways that you can do this, at least for lips, is as you're talking, here and there, lick your lips as you're talking, and that can help keep them a little bit moisturized. It's not really the best thing to do. It's better to lip balm your lips ahead of time. But the other thing is, don't close your lips. So as long as your lips are staying open, then there won't be the chance of those sounds, or it won't be as much of a chance. So as soon as I close my lips, they stick together, so that then when I open my lips and start speaking again, it's more likely you'll hear the little as my lips are opening. So there are some things you can do, some technique, some practical things like drink more water, use lip balm, eat a green apple, technique with microphone, maybe some stuff that you can do, other health things or techniques that you can learn with speaking to reduce the amount of mouth noises, or just let some of those things go through. You could look for maybe a click removal tool, but whenever you do something that's automated, you have to be concerned about what else is it going to remove and process that it shouldn't. So you might not need it that much. And it really depends on when those mouth noises are happening. If they're happening when you're not talking, then maybe it's something that you can use a gate, or you can use a software gate for this as well, that it will close and allow no noise in as long as the noise is below a particular threshold. But once the noise goes above that threshold, then the gate opens wide and lets all sound through. Like you're hearing the gate function right now while I'm talking. When I'm silent, you hear nothing. When I'm talking, the gate opens fully, so you may be hearing the hiss of my computer in the background, because while I'm live streaming, this is one of the reasons why I don't always recommend live streaming if you want the highest quality audio, but while I'm live streaming, my computer is working pretty hard, so it's making background noise. There's a plane in the background flying overhead as well, but when I stop talking, it closes. So even while I'm watching a little light right now on my gate, I just made some mouth noises, and I could see that the gate never opened because those mouth noises were too quiet. But if I'm making those mouth noises while the gate is open, they'll certainly be let through completely. Chuck, or maybe it was Joe, because it's kind of hard to tell from the Twitter account or the email, asked, is it common for recording track A to bleed randomly into track B during playback? Happened twice in 1 week to us. Translation: during playback of one segment, we hear another previously recorded segment begin to play simultaneously and unexpectedly. This is very weird, because especially since you're talking about different segments crossing over with each other, you might want to consider seeking some spiritual help with this one. No, I'm kidding there. This is still weird, though. So there could be some unconventional things going on that could be causing this to happen. A couple things to look out for, and it depends on how you're recording. Like if you're in the same room, if you're recording separately over Skype, something like that. If you are recording remotely, you're in one location, your co-host is in another location, there is that chance that sound could be looping back at a slight delay because of how it passes through the internet. Or maybe if you're live streaming, maybe someone has the live stream playing and it's leaking through. I'm actually quite surprised that on my Behringer mixer, or maybe, I know some people might say, oh, you shouldn't be surprised because it's Behringer. Behringer isn't that bad, guys. But I do have a Behringer mixer that I know isn't as powerful enough to power something like a Shure SM7B. You need a powerful, clean preamp for that. But it's still a pretty good mixer. So one of the things that I've noticed is if I mute a channel on the mixer, I can still hear sound from that channel very, very, very faintly. Same thing with the Audio-Technica ATR 2100. It has the switch on it that you can switch on and off. And when you switch it off, listen closely, and sound actually still makes its way through. So the point isn't that, well, let me say this differently. You might be getting some kind of leak like that. So look to make sure nothing is playing accidentally. There's no loop back happening where audio is leaking back through. Make sure people's headphones aren't too loud. But when you're talking about audio from one segment leaking through into another segment, this is more than a couple seconds of leak. Although if you're live streaming, then it's possible that the leak could be a minute delayed, or even maybe more, or a little bit less than that. So if you're live streaming, that could be an issue there. But if you're running into something where there's something from 5 minutes ago leaking into your audio 5 minutes later, that's a really weird issue. And I'm not exactly sure what to say for you to fix that. Because, at least in the hardware sense, there's no reason that should happen. In software, if it happens before you process things, then that's even more suspect. But if it happens after you process things, maybe there's a chance the software is very badly written, that it's doing some weird things with your audio. Maybe it's spirits, evil spirits in your recording. You've got gnomes in your recording. I'd really have to hear a sample, but I'm guessing that in your particular case, it's probably something like headphone leak. Someone has the live page going. There's some kind of loop back happening. And this can be tricky to filter out sometimes too. So maybe turn down the headphones, get closer to the microphones, make sure no one is playing the live recording. Make sure you're not playing the live stream while you're recording. Certain things like that, so you're not creating any kind of loop and a feedback loop of any sort. Next question from Samantha is, well, she asked a few questions, all looking for the cheapest recording mic, hosting site, editing software, and how/when to monetize. So first, the cheapest things. I don't really recommend looking for the cheapest stuff. The reason is cheap is cheap. Inexpensive might be cheap. Cheap might give you bad quality. Cheap might put you in a situation that you can't get yourself out of. Cheap might mean you start something and then you lose control of your audience. You lose ownership of it. So don't always look for the cheapest solution. Just today, I saw someone on Reddit was asking, best free podcast hosting service, go. Well, they didn't word it that way, but they did ask, what's the best free podcast hosting service? And so I responded with a new illustration that I think I'll reuse several times. And that is, well, asking for the best free podcast hosting service is kind of like asking which burning pile of dog poo smells the best. They all stink. And it's very similar with podcast hosting. Free podcast hosting, you really do get what you pay for. And if you're paying nothing for it, you're not going to get something that you can really rely on. Opinion, for example, had this mobile app, and they made big news for a while that here's this podcast hosting company. You can record the podcast directly on your mobile phone. You can do these things. You can edit your audio on your phone vertically instead of horizontally. They had some pretty cool ingenuity in their app. And they had free podcast hosting for a while. And just recently they announced that not only are they discontinuing the free podcast hosting, they're shutting down their company because they ran out of money due to free podcast hosting. Offering stuff for free is not a business model. So anyone who does is not going to stay in business for long. Yes, there's an extent that you can offer stuff for free as maybe it's your cost of acquisition or marketing or certain things like that. For example, mypodcastreviews.com has a free plan, which I offer for those hobbyist podcasters who can't afford to pay $5 a month, but they do want to see their global podcast reviews. So there is a very limited free plan for those who don't have a business-oriented podcast. And yeah, it costs me a little bit to offer that, but it's not that much. It's enough. It's small enough that I'm willing to absorb that. And if I had, though, 20,000 people on the free plan and only 100 people on the paid plan, then I would need to make some changes and consider adjusting some things. But I think I offer enough value in the paid plans that I don't need to worry about everyone flocking to the free plan, especially since there are certain limitations with the terms of service. So anyway, free podcast hosting, I really can't recommend a good place. What I can tell you to avoid hacking things together, like using Dropbox or Google Drive. I would even say maybe avoid archive.org. That's very popular and many people use that, and you could kind of get away with that. But I would actually recommend you host your media on your own website server before hosting it on archive.org. So let's talk about cheap instead. What's the lowest cost option? I think for the biggest bang for your buck without having to sacrifice actual existence of your podcast, I think Podbean might be your best option there. Now, Podbean's services are a little bit slower than everyone else's, but Podbean is pretty good they're at the bottom of my top list. So I would say Spreaker and Blueberry and Libsyn host or share the number one spot on my list for recommendations. They've been in this space the longest. They follow the standards in this space. They help set the standards. They are IAB compliant with their stats. They have industry standard podcasting. They've been in this space so long that they know these situations that come up. They have a working business model. They're profitable companies, so they're going to be around for a while. They're my top recommendations. Then they're compatible with everything, and they're good. Spreaker used to be in that top list, but I've kind of removed them for now, just for some other reasons until they get iOS 11 fully supported. At the bottom of my top list is Podbean, because Podbean has actually gotten pretty good. I met Shannon Martin from Podbean a few years ago, and I said, one of the things that podcasters are really shooting themselves in the foot for if they switch over to Podbean is that you don't offer them an option that they can leave Podbean and take their audience with them. Could you consider putting in a 301 redirect? A couple months later, Shannon emails me and says, thanks for the feedback. We now allow podcasters to ask for a permanent 301 redirect. So if they want to leave and take their audience with them, they can. Big perks. Big promotion, in my opinion. Podbean also helps sponsor International Podcast Day. They were one of our bronze sponsors. Big thanks to them for that. They're connected in this industry. We see Podbean in these communities at conferences and such. They've really made good strides recently. So at the bottom of my top list then is Podbean. Why the bottom? Just because their service isn't as fast and certain other things, but they're still pretty good. So best bang for the buck, or at least the cheapest best, let me put it that way, podcast hosting service, I would say, would be Podbean. And you can get a free month also with my promo code Noodle. There are other services out there, but they're so new, they're so amateur, they're so uninformed about the podcasting space, they're so disconnected from the podcasting space. I really can't recommend any other services. Yeah, I know a lot of them look really nice, have very tempting stats, all kinds of certain things, but I see a lot of things they're doing wrong, enough that I just can't recommend them yet. And when they fix those issues and show that they're more connected in the space, then I might consider recommending them. I don't only recommend companies because they have affiliate links. It just so happens that the companies I choose to recommend do have affiliate programs. You also asked for cheapest recording mic, editing software. Well, cheapest editing software is easy. Audacity works on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, and it's pretty good. Cheapest recording mic, well, cheapest one is actually whatever you have, which you might have in your computer or on your phone. The thing is about any microphone is technique matters almost more than the microphone itself. Because I've done some tests with the built-in microphone in my laptop computer, and if I got close to that microphone, about a fist width away, and the computer wasn't making much noise, I wasn't typing, I wasn't running intensive processes, I wasn't live streaming a podcast, so the computer was virtually silent, I could get pretty good sounding audio using the microphone that way. Now, it was very uncomfortable because I had to bend over with my head near the laptop, so it's not practical at all to do it like that. But it did sound pretty good. The microphone on your smartphone is also very good, and the microphone on this is better than the microphone on headsets, even like the Apple EarPods and such. So you could use this like a studio microphone. Same thing, be about a fist width away from the microphone. Don't have background noise going. Make sure that the microphone is pointed at you, kind of at an angle, so that your puffs of air, like Peter Piper picked a peck, those plosives that are coming out of your mouth aren't hitting the microphone. They're going over here, missing the microphone. You can get pretty good audio. And there are a lot of really successful podcasters that record parts of their episodes that way. And unfortunately, we can never say, well, because so-and-so does it, it's okay, and it's not hurting them. We can never really say that, because you'd have to have an alternate reality monitor system of some sort in order to really know, is that hurting them or is it helping them? Because you might say, well, so-and-so records this way, and they have thousands of listeners, so it doesn't seem to be hurting them. Well, you don't know that. Maybe if they recorded differently, they'd have tens of thousands of listeners instead of thousands, or hundreds of thousands instead of tens of thousands. You really can't know for sure. The main thing is it distracting? Guys like former Dirty Jobs, Mike Rowe, he has a podcast that's really fun. If you like the Story Behind podcast, which is from community member Emily Prokop, great podcast. I really enjoy that podcast. It's one of the podcasts that I save for listening on my drive home from work, and it helps me shift focus away from work mode to home life mode. And it's very entertaining to learn the story behind things. Like pumpkin spice. Did you know, by the way, pumpkin spice actually has almost nothing to do with pumpkin? Yeah, really. You got to listen to Emily Prokop's podcast to learn more. Anyway, if you like Emily Prokop's podcast, then you'll also like Mike Rowe's podcast, which is called The Way I Heard It. Emily, you like the way I spun that around? So in The Way I Heard It, Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs has some story. It's very much like a modern, who's that other radio guy now? I can't remember, but the guy that said, now you know the rest of the story, that guy. So it's very much like that podcast where it takes you all the way to the end and you're like, whoa, that's who this story was about. So Mike Rowe records the majority of that story in a professional recording studio. The quality is pristine. And he starts his podcast with a little welcome, a sponsorship spot and such. And what does he record that on? Whatever microphone he has. Sometimes it's his smartphone. Sometimes it's some microphone he has at home. Sometimes it's something else. And yes, I can tell a difference, even listening through earbuds, listening while driving in a car. I can tell a difference because I'm sensitive to audio quality like that. But does it prevent me from hearing the content, understanding the content, enjoying the content? No, it doesn't, not at all. Jennifer Briney from Congressional Dish podcast, a very popular political podcast where, good job, Jennifer. She really does a great job monetizing that podcast. But she also looks at congressional bills and talks about them and traces where the money is. And there have been a couple episodes where she's been at a hotel or something, didn't bring a certain microphone or anything, whatever. She would record into her phone. And yes, the quality was different, but it wasn't unlistenable. It was fine for listening. I wouldn't say build your platform on low quality audio. The most important things are for people to be able to hear you, that's your volume level, and understand you, that's the clarity of your audio. So the difference between the microphone in an iPhone and a studio microphone, like my Electro Voice RE320, yeah, there's a difference. There's a noticeable difference. I would say this in my studio, pristine audio quality. So it sounds really good. It's completely undistracting. But I could still reach an audience with this. Now, it's nice to have better audio quality when you can. But do what you can. It's more important to get your message out there so it can be heard and understood. And then the final question here, or the final part of Samantha's question is, how and when to monetize. How to monetize is a big issue. First, let me address when to monetize. If you are podcasting as part of a business, if you have a business-oriented podcast, when to monetize, episode 1. Find some way to monetize, and there are many ways to monetize. Even if you make no money from it, you want that foundation of monetizing to be there. So you're asking people to take action on something. Join your email list, buy a little $5 product, hire you for consulting, anything, whatever it can be. Or maybe you're recommending a book, a product through an affiliate link, something like that. You want that foundation to be there for monetization so that you can build on that later on. You can replace that with things later on. That's if you're doing a business-oriented podcast. I think you need to have that foundation for monetization from the beginning. If you have a hobby-focused podcast, then you don't have to think about monetizing. Monetizing is extra icing on top of already good icing on top of a good cake. I love cake icing. Well, certain cake icings, by the way, that is. I love like Here's guilty pleasure for me, like a Pillsbury or Betty Crocker tub of icing and graham crackers or animal crackers. Ooh, that's good. Just dip it in there, scoop it out. Oh, that's so good. Like cream cheese icing or vanilla icing. Oh, that's my guilty pleasure. So that's why I say icing on top of already good icing. So bringing this back to podcasting. And yes, I'm holding a headphone jack. I tend to fidget sometimes. In podcasting, if you're doing this for a hobby, if you're doing this for the fun of it, fun is one of the ways you can profit from your podcast. Go back to the audacitypodcast.com/profit, PROFIT, and you'll learn what profit stands for. It stands for popularity, relationships, opportunities, fun, income, and tangibles. These are different ways that you can profit from your podcast. So you don't have to monetize your podcast in order to profit from it. You can profit in all kinds of other ways. If you do need to monetize or want to monetize the podcast, even if it's just to cover your expenses, when to monetize is when it makes sense. I really suggest, if you're with any kind of podcast, really, your perspective, even if it's business oriented, your perspective should always be deliver value first before asking for value back from your audience. So with a hobbyist podcast, it might be better to do several episodes without even trying to monetize it at all. Build an audience, build a community, build a fan base. How to monetize? The easy way to monetize is find products that you can mention that are relevant to your audience and products that you would truly recommend, and try and get an affiliate relationship for those products or for some retailer that sells those products, like Amazon.com. When I made my first, I think it was 36 cents on Amazon, boy, I felt like a superhero. I felt like nothing could stop me now. I've made money on the internet. Yes, passive income, 36 cents or whatever it was. It took months to actually get paid that 36 cents because I had to reach a certain threshold. But it was exciting and it was something relevant. Now, affiliate income is sometimes half of my income comes from affiliates, things that I truly believe in. I recommend in relevant contexts, and people buy them on my recommendations. Sometimes they buy them despite my recommendations because they just wanted to hear my perspective before they made a decision or before they press the buy button, and people still buy them. Like Blog Talk Radio, for example. For a while, I said, don't sign up, don't sign up. I don't like Blog Talk Radio, but I still used an affiliate link. I said, if you really want Blog Talk Radio, here's my affiliate link you're welcome to use, but I really don't recommend you do it. People still did it, and I got paid a couple dollars or something. So you can find ways to monetize through other products and services to recommend. The best way, regardless of what kind of podcast you have, the best way to monetize, two different ways. One, crowdfunding. Get your audience donating to you. Throwing this back to Emily Prokop's podcast, The Story Behind, the list of executive producers that she mentions in her podcast is growing. And I think that's awesome. She does this podcast for the fun of it. And it's a fun podcast to listen to. And people are sending her $1 a month, $5 a month, whatever. She's monetizing that podcast. I'm not even sure if she's providing extra value other than just the shout out for those people who support her podcast. But they feel like they belong. They want to contribute to the value they are receiving. Value for value model. And the person who came up with that term, value for value, is Adam Curry, the podfather, the guy who made podcasting basically a thing. One of the guys. And Adam Curry's podcast, The No Agenda Show, provides huge value and entertainment and political value and all kinds of things. And people support it and give huge amounts. There are people who've donated thousands of dollars to that podcast and become knights and dames and barons and baronesses and all of these terms and labels, and they're part of the community. They donate because they get value from it, so they give value back. For our Once Upon a Time podcast, there's someone who's been supporting us for years, and last I checked, I think she's given us over $2,000 for a free podcast about a free TV show. It's because she gets value from us, so she gives us value back. So if you can get your audience providing value in that kind of way. That can be a great way to monetize. The other best way to monetize is if you have something of your own to sell. I run a business. My business is helping podcasters. So my podcast about podcasting often promotes that business. And the main focus of my business now is Podcaster Society. And I have many people join Podcaster Society who say, actually someone just joined recently. Let me find this message really quickly. I won't name them at the moment because I didn't get the permission to name them. But someone said, I'd learned so much about podcasting listening to your podcast during the last 3 years that I decided to become a member of this valuable community. Congratulations for the good work. That's from a brand new member who joined yesterday. So it's because I've given value in other ways. They decided they wanted to give back value and buy something from me. So if you can sell something of your own, that's huge potential for monetizing your podcast. Okay, more things here. I will get through these. I see no questions have come up yet in the chat room, and if any do, I'm going to have to push those toward next week's live Q&A. Mondays, 2 p.m. Eastern, theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. So go ahead and ask your question, but I'll just copy and paste it for next week's list. I want to make it through this list. Stephen said a follow-up question to episode 305, which was about podcast length. How important is a consistent length? So in episode 305, I said the basic conclusion is your podcast episode should be as long as they need to be. No longer, no shorter. You don't have to make it 25.4 minutes or anything like that, as long as it needs to be. How important is consistent length then? So that's Stephen's follow-up question. By the way, if you want to listen to that episode, it's episode 305 at theaudacitytopodcast.com/length, LENGTH. So how important is consistent length? It's a little important, but if you're between having a consistent length of whatever it is and adjusting, how am I saying this? Let me put it this way. It's more important that each episode delivers on the value it's promised and doesn't waste time. So if that means one episode is 20 minutes and your next episode is 60 minutes, but both episodes provide a ton of value, yes, it may mean your audience might take a little bit longer to consume that 60-minute episode. They might be initially disappointed that, oh, this one's longer. But as long as you're providing great value, they won't mind. I do recommend try to target a consistent length. But it's okay if you don't reach that. For our Once Upon a Time podcast, for a few years, we would do initial reactions the night of the TV show episode, and then later in the week, we would do a full discussion. Now, episode length does not necessarily dictate your stats or how much each episode will be downloaded, but more consistently, the longer episodes were downloaded more than the shorter episodes. I think maybe people saw this one's initial reactions, this one's full discussion. I'm more interested in the full discussion. So that was where we did two formats in the same podcast. If you're in a situation where your episodes are significantly different in length, like 20 minutes and then 3 hours, that might be something to consider unless it's a rare case. Like for the Audacity podcast, most of my episodes lately have been 20 to 30 minutes, 35 minutes maybe. I had a 3-hour long episode for episode 301. It took people longer to listen to it, but they did listen to it. So how important is a consistent length? Sure, you can try and shoot for it, and it's a good discipline to keep in your mind, okay, it's about an hour now, we need to keep moving this conversation along, but it doesn't mean you have to say, oh, we're at an hour, it's time to end the podcast. If it's good content, don't end it early. I mean, what if, whatever your favorite movie or franchise is, what if they decide, okay, Harry Potter, let's take this one, since this is, I think the Harry Potter movies, especially the last ones, were really good movies. What if they took that last movie, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and instead of splitting it into 2 separate movies, what if they did make it one movie and the length of only one movie? Do you think it would have been as good? Probably not. I know that some people thought, oh, they're just trying to squeeze more money from it and all of this stuff. But looking at the books and knowing how the story needed to end and all of the details that needed to be included, making it 2 separate movies was good. They didn't say, nope, we can't have it any longer than this. They extended it. So it's not all that important to have a completely consistent length. Sure, you can target a certain length, but it's more important that you don't waste time and that you are constantly giving value. Emily said, if they'd shortened Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, maybe Dobby wouldn't die. Spoiler, by the way. Too late to tell you that. Stacy asked, what's the best way to live stream for my listeners? I'm thinking Facebook Live and recording the audio simultaneously and separately. Is there a YouTube or Google or audio only live option that's better? I'm not planning to do this more than 2 to 3 times a year, so I don't want to pay a lot to sign up for something. Well, if you're doing it live, then I think it's the point of live really is to be engaging. And I think it's more engaging if you're on video. Like I'm doing this microphone thing. I'm using the lavalier microphone instead of my normal studio microphone because I felt like this would be more engaging. The audio quality is lower. I know that because this is an omnidirectional microphone I'm wearing because it's farther from my mouth and it's closer to my computer. I know I'm picking up more background noise as my computer is making this hiss. But I felt like those are reasonable sacrifices because I really feel like this is more engaging to not have this microphone in my face like this. And I can lean back and talk. I can lean forward and talk and not have to move the microphone with me. So that's all focused on engagement, making this more engaging. So if you're doing live, I really recommend that you do it in video because that's more engaging. People can see you. And the best live video options are Facebook Live or YouTube Live. And it really depends on your approach to this. If you want to send people to your website, then YouTube Live is good. If you want your live stream to be a little bit more viral, then Facebook Live is good. I'm hosting this Q&A through Facebook Live because I like some of the built-in features of sharing and such. And I'm not trying to own the live platform. I just want to point people there. But when you go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/live, it takes you to Facebook Live. So I think Facebook Live is great. YouTube Live is great as well. YouTube Live allows you to embed it. If you don't have the technology for video, like you don't have a webcam at all, then you could look at audio-only solutions. But let me back up before I mention that. If you're concerned about the quality of your video, the most important thing about the quality of your video is the quality of your audio, because you want people to be able to hear and understand you. The next most important thing about your video is not the camera, it's the lighting. I'll illustrate this for you. I will turn on my room lights and turn off my studio lights and put my webcam back into default exposure mode. And this is what you might see with typical webcam lighting. Very discolored. The blue lights in the background are especially messing up with the coloring, so let me turn those off. There we go. It still looks kind of cheap. The camera's having to work a lot harder to expose the scene properly because there's not as much light. Doesn't look all that great. This looks like a basic web camera. And you'll see people that have even worse looking video where they've got an open window behind them so their face is darkened and bleached out, or the background is bleached out, or their face is bleached out. All kind of weird things can happen depending on how their webcam is configured. So that's why I use professional lighting, and you can get some good lighting inexpensively. So if I switch to, this is my configuration from my web camera, so you can see how much light it's making up for. Then I'll turn on the studio lights, turn off the room lights, and turn my backdrop lights. Come on, both of them. Both lights. Come on, both lights. There we go. So now it looks cool. It's the same camera, just different lighting. And it's the web camera. So your lighting will affect the camera a whole lot more. And great lighting you can get from a window. Face the window. Don't have the window behind you. Face the window. You can drape a white bed sheet or a shower curtain or something like that over the window to soften the light and diffuse it. And that can look beautiful and look really good. So have good audio, have good lighting, and you might be fine with whatever web camera you have. So if you need to do audio only though, for whatever reason, then what I recommend is Mixlr, M-I-X-L-R, especially if you're just doing a one-off kind of thing. Because Mixlr, you can sign up for 1 month at a time, and it's, I think, $10 a month for one of their plans that lets you broadcast for up to 3 hours. So you can sign up for 1 month, downgrade to a free plan, then a few months later, upgrade to a paid plan, do your live broadcast downgrade. You could also look at Spreaker, SPREAKER.com, and they offer live streaming tools as well. And you can use promo code Noodle to sign up over there. Although with Spreaker, I don't think they offer any kind of free plan. So you'd have to close your account in order to save the money. So Mixlr, M-I-X-L-R, I recommend. I don't have a promo code for them, but that's what I use if I want to offer an audio-only stream as an option. There is also Facebook Live Audio, which I haven't played with, but that might be a reasonable solution for you as well. Last question from Armando Loyola. This came in through Twitter. He said, how to bring the podcast culture to those less enlightened? How? Listen to the episode I'm publishing on October 10th at theaudacitytopodcast.com. That will be episode 326, how you can help podcasting grow. A great conversation I had with Elsie Escobar. We had that conversation on International Podcast Day. The main point of it, if you want to bring the podcast culture to those that are less enlightened, you have to make it relevant to them. I host a podcast about podcasting. There's no point in my getting the guy next door to listen to my podcast about podcasting unless he actually wants to start a podcast. But what I could do instead, and what you could do, is for those people that you're talking to, focus on the content, the value that they can get, not the technology. Focus on the stories, focus on the information, focus on the entertainment. And one of the ways that I commonly like to do this is I'll ask someone, what's your favorite TV show? They'll tell me, and then I'll show them in a podcast app, look, here are all of these podcasts about your favorite TV show. This one interviews a few of the cast members. This one's digging in depth into theories and discussion of that TV show. Find something that's relevant to them and go listen to that episode number 326 of The Audacity to Podcast over at theaudacitytopodcast.com. All right, that's it for the live Q&A for today. Let me know what you thought of the audio as it comes from this lavalier microphone and what you thought, actually not so much of the audio quality, but what did you think of the engagement quality of this? This is something I would only do for webinars or live streams maybe, when the audio quality is less important than the engagement quality. So did you feel like this was more engaging because I didn't have a microphone in front of me? Let me know, comment on this video. And if you have a question about podcasting that you'd like me to answer in a future podcasting Q&A, then email feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com. Try and keep that question concise. That makes it easier to include in the list as well. And join me Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching.